Chapter 5. Doreen tossed her cell phone on the countertop and screamed at the empty kitchen in sheer frustration. After a moment, she felt better. Only Muggs had decided he should accompany her in this ritual, and was still howling. As he slowly stopped, she could hear Thaddeus kicking up a fuss, marching across the table crowing and cawing, like he was singing some kind of a crazy-ass tempo. That was probably what she had sounded like to him. She tossed her purse and jacket beside her phone and walked over to the coffee pot. "It is definitely time for a cup of coffee," she muttered to herself, deliberately not counting the cost of her increased coffee habit. She also knew that Mac would arrive soon, asking her questions. He always drank her out of coffee. But still, he also made a mean pot. Even though she'd tried everything she could, and it was good coffee that she now made, he had that magic touch. It occurred to her that maybe what made it better was how she didn't have to do it herself. That was a consideration, since she still had fond memories of all the coffee she used to have in her former life, none of which had ever been prepared by her hand. Living in a multi-million-dollar house with a rich lifestyle had a lot of perks. And delightful coffee every day whenever she wanted it was one of them. She ground the beans, filled the carafe in the back of the coffee maker, and pushed the button for it to start. Then she walked over to the fridge and opened it up. If nothing else, she should put away the carrot cake and sandwich. She really wanted to eat the cake because it was so damn good. But half of that was because she was so stressed. Finally, when the coffee was done, she grabbed a cup, pushed open the back door, and stepped onto the veranda. It was old and creaky, but the place was hers, and right now she needed that solace. With the animals following along in her wake, she wandered down the garden. It was only here in her backyard, finding private space where nobody else could interfere, that she managed to de-stress. Almost on automatic pilot, her feet took her to the creek. She perched on the log close to her property, but just ever so slightly on public access. There she sat, watching the water trickle down the creek bed. It was so soothing. Muggs walked into the creek until his big thick feet were covered in water, and drooped his head down so he could take a drink. Of course his ears drooped down with him, so they sank into the water too. She sighed. "Muggs, could you at least lift them out of the way so they don't get wet every time?" He just gave her a sad basset-eyed look, and kept doing what he was doing. She said, "I guess I should be happy you're not going for a complete swim." With his typical disdain of everything that Muggs did, Goliath sat perched on a rock, his tail wrapped around him in a perfect formation. The cat stared down at the water in fascination, but with an equal amount of revulsion. She couldn't imagine him ever fishing. He was just too dainty, even though there was nothing dainty about him. But he hated water. And at the same time, it seemed like he couldn't leave it alone. She wondered how he ever reconciled his relationship with that stuff. Thaddeus, on the other hand, walked up and down the log she was on, calling to Muggs, "Drink the water. Drink the water." She chuckled at him. He cocked his head, looked at her preening in the fresh air. He really was a lovely addition to her family. She'd never considered having a bird as a pet before. She had to clean up after him, as well as after the cat and the dog, but she enjoyed the bit of house cleaning she now did. The vacuum was pretty old, but luckily it still worked, and that was all she cared about. Knowing that this was her place made a huge difference too. Hard to believe she'd been here for a couple of weeks now. The house felt like home. It still smelled like Nan, yet musty, mixed with old dust. Doreen was slowly getting it into better shape, which was a miracle, considering she had no money for that. It boiled down to good old hard work. Doreen had brought up the antiques with Nan, but had forgotten to ask her if she knew the history of any of the pieces. Doreen also needed to find an antique specialist, hopefully to advise her if some of these pieces were valuable. Speaking of which, Doreen walked back to the house and stepped inside to retrieve her phone from the countertop and dialed Wendy's number at the consignment store as Doreen headed back to the log at the creek. "Hi, Wendy. This is Doreen." "Hi, Doreen," Wendy said gaily. She was always so happy. Doreen was kind of jealous of her in a way. "What can I do for you?" Wendy asked. "Or do you have more clothes to bring in?" "Actually, I don't," she said, "although there might be a bit more. I still have the master bedroom to go through." "Oh my goodness. Was all that stuff you brought before from the spare bedroom?" "Yes," Doreen said with a half laugh. "It was." "Goodness. You should sort through the rest and bring it to me," she said. "I've sold several of the pieces and one of the fur coats. Now, remember, I don't pay anything to you for a while. I pay 90 days out in case people return items." No, I understand that," Doreen said quickly because she hadn't in the least understood that at all. Wendy had probably explained it to her, but, as Doreen's former husband would say, she just didn't get money. She wasn't stupid, she just didn't realize how these cycles worked. "So you're saying that, after 90 days, you'll call me and tell me how much money there is for me?" "Yes, and then I pay on the 15th of the next month after the 90 days. It's a lot of accounting, particularly when my customers are allowed that 90 days to bring something back." Doreen trusted Wendy. Whether that was the right thing to do or not, Doreen didn't have a whole lot of choice. "What did you sell the fur coat for, by the way?" she asked curiously. "We didn't really discuss prices on any of the items I brought in." "Nope, but I think I've sold about $100 worth of stuff for you already," she said, "and that's without the fur coat. I sold it for $145. Her voice turned distracted as she said, "I can look it up for you if you like." No, Doreen said in delight. "I'm just glad to hear you're selling some of these items. Very encouraging." "And," Wendy said, "hopefully we'll double or triple that amount before the 90 days are up. Especially if you bring in more stuff, maybe we can get you a bit every quarter." "That's a good idea." Doreen brightened. "Now I'm looking for an antiques dealer in town." "I don't know about a dealer," she said, "but Fen Gunderson owned his own antique shop. He's retired now, but he has an excellent eye. If you're looking for some advice, you should talk to him." "And where would I find him?" she asked. "He lives in Upper Mission." She'd been in Kelowna long enough now to understand where she was living was the Mission, and to the south of her house was Upper Mission. It made no sense to her geographically. But hey, she didn't determine the boundaries of the area. "I will look him up and see if he'll talk to me. He's easy to find. He volunteers at the Mission Bible thrift store. You can always find him in the back testing toasters and any other godforsaken appliances people bring in." Wendy went off on a happy laugh. "He's a sweetheart, though. I'm sure he'd love to come to Nan's old house and see what she's got. He could definitely tell you which pieces are valuable." "That would be ideal," Doreen exclaimed. "I have no way of knowing what's valuable and what isn't." "Exactly," Wendy said. "I do have people at the store waiting for me now. So when you get a chance, go through some more clothes and come over. Even if you just want to visit, you're always welcome." She hung up, leaving Doreen sitting beside the river. She looked back at the old house that needed a new roof, and at the veranda that listed sideways. Yet she smiled. It was hers. It was a roof over her head. With a little bit of work and a whole lot of goodwill and elbow grease, she would do just fine. When she heard her name called out, she shouted back, realizing she shouldn't have done that. It could be anybody. And anybody tended to be reporters. Immediately, she heard a disgusted sound from behind the fence of her neighbor. "What are you doing hiding out back there?" she asked. Doreen frowned. She had yet to figure out the sex of that speaker, based on that unisex voice. She'd met the man of the house, and as far as she understood, a wife lived there. But Doreen had yet to meet her. And this disembodied voice from the backyard talking to her had never identified itself, so Doreen didn't know if it was the husband or the wife. "I'm not hiding out at all," Doreen said in exasperation. "I'm out here enjoying the creek." "Dirty thing," the voice said. "And stop yelling. You're disturbing my nap." Doreen raised both hands and shook her head. Even here, apparently, minding her own business in her own backyard, she was a problem. But as she looked toward the house, she saw Mac step onto her veranda. She smiled and waved, then stood. Thaddeus raced toward her. She bent down and let him climb onto her hand and lifted him to her shoulder. Muggs barked joyfully at their visitor. Goliath looked at them all with that disdainful and haughty Lord of the Manor look that seemed to say, "You don't expect me to greet everyone, do you? Just because you do." Muggs, on the other hand, already raced madly toward Mac. Muggs apparently thought Mac was just fine. As a watchdog, he sucked, usually barking after she heard a knock on her door. However, he'd had his uses these last few days, so it was all good. Besides, she loved that adorable mutt. He was family. He'd been there for her through thick and thin, and she loved his jowls, every wrinkle of them. As she walked toward Mac, she held up her cup. "There's a fresh pot of coffee." His face lit up. He turned and disappeared into her kitchen. She chuckled. Who'd have thought my one and only friend in this town would end up being a police detective? She was still smiling until her gaze landed on the brown dirt patches across her garden. Mac stepped outside. "Now what's bothering you?" "The mess your men left," she snapped. She strode up the veranda steps and glared at him as she entered her kitchen. "They should fix it." "We've discussed this already," he said in exasperation, "many times over. They're not fixing anything. They're the ones who ripped apart all of my backyard." She put down her cup and filled it. He'd taken the largest mug in the house, so there was barely enough for her to have another cup. With her coffee in hand, she walked to the kitchen table and sat down. "They didn't dig it up. They removed a dead body hidden on your property." "But I didn't hide it," she said with logic. "So that's got nothing to do with me." "Forget it," he said with a shake of his head, joining her at the table. "You're not getting free gardening work done for you by the RCMP." She sighed and propped her chin on her palm. "So what did you find out about the case?" "There is no case." He pulled out a notepad, put it on the kitchen table, and scooted his coffee cup back. "So let's get your statement." "Right," she said. She repeated what she'd done from the time she'd seen the couple in the garden shop, right through to when she found the body. When she finally ran dry, she realized she'd drunk the rest of her coffee. She stared longingly at the empty pot. He glanced at her and then at the pot. "Go put on another one." She shrugged and sat where she was. "Are you trying to get me to put on a pot?" She gave him a wide-eyed, innocent look. "Of course not. Why would I do that?" But he didn't seem to believe her. He stared at her, then said, "You make a great pot these days. What difference does it make who prepares it?" She crossed her arms over her chest, settled back in the chair. "I just don't want any more." He finished his cup, looked at it, and said, "If you don't want any more, do you mind if I put on another pot?" She leaned forward eagerly. "No, no. You go ahead." He glared at her. "You're being foolish. Your coffee is every bit as good as mine is." "Do you think so?" she asked. She watched as he took exactly the same steps as she had done to brew coffee. When the coffee dripped happily, he sat back down again. "Yes, your coffee is every bit as good as mine is." Thaddeus, at that point, disappeared into the living room. When he got bored, he returned and hopped up onto her knee, climbed up her arm onto the table. He walked to her cup and pecked at it. She shooed him away and moved the cup. He just started doing that. "I don't understand why." Has he got lots of food? She stood, walked over to make sure herself. After forgetting a few days ago, she said, I felt so bad that I'm probably overfeeding them now. In the front hall, she found the bag of birdseed, grabbed a handful, and set it on the kitchen table. Thaddeus went at it. She groaned. At the rate he's eating, I'll have to buy another bag soon. Have you bought any yet? She shook her head. No. So far all the supplies Nan left are holding me in good stead. Good, he said. Your money will go a little further then. She nodded. Not very far, but far enough. Now tell me what I need to know. He looked at her in surprise. What caliber were the bullets that killed her? How many times was she shot? What was the cause of death? I'm presuming it was the bullets, she said, because I saw her just a short time earlier. However, her neck looked a little bruised, and I don't remember seeing that earlier. You noticed that, did you? He said. I noticed it too. He tapped his notepad with his pencil. The thing is, until the coroner has a chance to check her over, we won't know the details. She nodded. How the hell did the old folks' home know right away? He groaned. No clue. The family planning center was still shut down since that unpleasantness last week. What unpleasantness? He shot her a look. Didn't you hear about it? I didn't even know that building existed until today, she said. So tell me. It's a family planning center and they're pro-choice, he said. A big kerfuffle occurred last week as a couple of men went in and hassled some of the women in the waiting room. It was bad enough they had to shut down the center while they reconsider security options. Were the men ever charged? He shrugged. I haven't heard. Do you work active cases or just cold cases? He let out a gust of air. As you know, I do both. So, what was the cold case you were going to tell me about before? He shook his head. Oh no, you don't. I want to know more about this couple. Did you hear any of their conversation? I told you that part already, she said. So is your cold case a murder, drugs, theft? None of that, he said. Missing kids, she guessed. He shot her a look. She crowed. I'm right, aren't I? She clapped her hands like a child. He shook his head. I'm not telling you if you're right or wrong. The bottom line is, we're not going there right now. She nodded. Okay, because really we have an active case we need to be working on. You gave me the name of the deceased and said she's a businesswoman, but what business does she own? He sighed. She's the one who handled the funding for the Family Planning Center, he said. She runs a service that connects financiers to businesses. Doreen stared at him for a long moment as the implications set in. So her body was dumped in front of a building she helped to start? He nodded. She sat back, her hand covering her mouth. Wow, she said. That's interesting. He shrugged. Of course it could be worse, she said. She could have created a candy shop. Maybe she would have been dumped in a vat of fudge or something. He stared at her. She chuckled. Okay. You know me. I'm just sorting through all the negatives, then finding something bright and cheerful to balance it out somehow. Finding a body in a vat of chocolate fudge, he said, is not cheerful. She shrugged, grabbed her coffee cup, and walked over to the pot. Maybe not, but there is fresh coffee, so I'm having a cup. She poured some and sat back down, waving her hand over the top, wafting away the steam. It's a missing kid, huh? Interesting case. He ignored her and tapped his notepad. Are you sure you didn't see anything else? She frowned. I thought the Family Planning Center building was empty, but I had this creepy feeling that somebody was watching me, you know? But then, when I turned around, I didn't see anybody in the windows. No. Like I said, it's been closed. Unless somebody was working, getting caught up, taking care of business while they didn't have to deal with the public, she said calmly. We know a lot of people would do that. What about janitors? He nodded. No one answered the officers who knocked. Just because you have an odd feeling isn't some reason for me to jump to conclusions that somebody in there was watching you. But not a reason not to say so either, she said with a chuckle, picking up her cup and taking a sip. As soon as she tasted it, she smiled. What's that smile for? His voice was suspicious but edged with humor. Her smile fell away, and she stared at him innocently. He sighed. Is it better? To my sadness, she said, it is. At that, he laughed. You're crazy. You know that, right? He said affectionately. She shrugged. But you like me anyway, so it's all good. How many kids went missing? 3, but they weren't all connected. He stopped and said, Goddamn it. She laughed. All boys? His brows came together. What makes you think they were boys? I don't know. I had good odds of being right, and I'm pretty good at playing the odds. Like grandmother, like granddaughter, he said with a head tilt and raised eyebrows. In that case, you should buy a lottery ticket. It would solve your money problems. That's true. The problem with that is, you have to have money in the first place. He grinned. True. I'll leave you now. He stood, grabbing his notebook. Make sure you don't talk to anybody about the case, please. I'll probably come back with some more questions later. But I'll call you before. Good enough, she said. Are we still having our cooking lesson on Monday? No reason not to. He turned and walked out.